All right, so today we're going to learn about reproduction. And while it's a funny topic that people don't really want to talk about, it's really important because without reproduction, then species go extinct. So we'll come back to this in a second. But what is the definition of reproduction? Reproduction can happen in a sexual or in an asexual form. Okay, and we're going to talk about both of those today. But the meaning of the process is that it leads to the formation of offspring. In human species, we call those babies. Sometimes you talk about bear, so those will be the cubs. In dogs, it would be puppies. So it is the offspring which leads to the continuation of the species. So like I was saying before, if there is no reproduction, meaning if a species, any kind, plants or animals, or bacteria or protozoa or any kind, if there is no reproduction of a living thing, then extinction takes place, which means it stops happening. Now, we're going to discuss different forms of sexual and asexual reproduction. So what I would like you to do is pause the video as you need and take notes given on your notebook. So here we go. We will start with asexual reproduction. So for that, I want to have these right here. And while there are different forms of asexual reproduction, what all forms have in common is that you start with an organism. An organism is unique because of its DNA. So what's going to happen is that in asexual reproduction, which means that there is no exchange of DNA, that organism basically divides itself to make a new organism. So it's an identical copy of itself. So while this one will divide again, and this one will divide again, so we can see that over time, we will end up with a lot of organisms that have identical DNA in asexual reproduction. That's why sometimes bacterial infections are easy to treat, but yet sometimes they can be difficult because if they have a mutation, then we cannot address it. But we'll discuss that later at another time. Now, like I was saying, there are different forms of asexual reproduction. The first one is called binary fission. And in binary fission, what happens is you have an organism, like I have right here. This is called an amoeba. And that is one full organism that is made up of just one cell. And right here in the nucleus, it stores its DNA. As you guys know, DNA is where all the genetic information is stored. So what happens during binary fission is that the nucleus begins to grow and divide. So you end up with an amoeba that it has two nuclei. That's the plural for nucleus. We don't say nucleuses. So the nucleus begins to grow, divides, and eventually everything around it makes the body of the amoeba begins to separate. Fission means to cut or to divide in two, and then you end up with two identical amoebas. And I know they're identical because they both started from the same body and from the same nucleus. So again, that is binary fission, meaning cutting in two. Another example of asexual reproduction is called budding. And budding is when you have an organism that instead of having one nucleus divide, it could be several, a multicellular organism, meaning it has lots of cells. In this case, I have a sponge. This is a sea sponge, and then it grows like a little bud. And that bud, because it came from the same organism, then it's going to have the same DNA, is going to be identical. And then that little bud begins to grow until eventually it separates. And now you have two organisms that are separate from each other, but then they have identical DNA. Example of those is the hydra, jellyfish, and like I said, sea sponges. So that is how budding happens. So again, it happens in multicellular organisms, and it grows a little bud, and then it creates a new organism identical to the mother or the parent. We don't call it the mother, but the parent organism. Now, another one is called fragmentation. And during fragmentation is when the organism is either by accident or because of a predator or for whatever reason, that organism ends up being cut in half. So this is an example of a planaria. And that is a flatworm. It's found in fresh water. It does look like a little arrow, and it has little eyes that are able to detect light to either follow or avoid it depending on what it's seeking. And then so if there is a cut, then we end up with two parts. And because it's been fragmented, then each part grows whatever is missing of the body. So A in the previous card, so right here, had the head, but it was missing its tail. And B, as you guys can see right here, had the tail, but it was missing the head. So then it'll grow whatever is missing. So A grew the rest of its tail, B grew the rest of the front of the body or the head. And those are going to be clones of each other. So that's also going to be asexual reproduction because they have identical DNA. Now, the last form of asexual reproduction, which is very common in some plants, is called vegetative propagation. You can see this in strawberries and in potatoes very commonly, in crops that are familiar to us, where you have a plant. So this would be an example of what a potato could be. You have a plant where you have the big kind of like root underground and it's growing. And then it begins to grow little buds, and those buds eventually propagate or distribute themselves to form a brand new plant, and that plant eventually will continue to, grow roots and become more stable and independent, but it is genetically, meaning its DNA, it's identical to the parent plant. Again, like I just said before, this is very common in potatoes and strawberries. Oops, ran out of space there for a second. All right, the last ones that I want to address then now is sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, you have a male and a female, and they are basically going to exchange their DNA. Their offspring is going to be an organism that has a little bit of both. So here I'm just using Play-Doh to demonstrate that you have a parent and two parents, male and female, and they are very different from each other. But the offspring, as you guys can see, has a little bit of blue, a little bit of green, and a little bit of yellow, meaning it represents a little bit of both. In animals, as we are familiar, we're going to be familiar with the sperm and egg. When they unite, and these are known as gametes. So these are sex cells or gametes. Sex cells or gametes. They will produce an offspring, and this could be either by egg, it could be a live birth. Those are kind of like the two ways that could be an egg or a live birth. They are not going to be identical to the parent. This provides what is known as genetic diversity, which you've heard about this before. Now, in plants, it's a little bit different, and it only happens in plants that have flowers. So plants reproduce either by vegetative propagation, asexually, or sexually with flowers. So right here I have a quick diagram, you've learned about flowers before. Well, this is the reproductive part of a flower. So this is kind of what's inside of the petals. You have these little sticks that we see. Those are called the stamen, and they hold the pollen. The pollen is going to be your male gamete, and they are going to be what bees and butterflies and the wind, they're going to distribute to the female part of the flower. It could be in the same flower, it could be two separate flowers in the same plant, it could be to other plants, to the female parts of other plants far away or nearby. So when a bee gets all covered in pollen, then that bee comes in and tries to, feed off another pollen, and then the pollen travels through the stigma, which is this big tube section, and down the style. The style is this little tiny tube, and then it reaches the ovule, which is these tiny little female sex cells. So these are your female gametes. And it would be really helpful if you drew this picture. So feel free to, again, to pause at any minute. And the gametes are all stored into this big bulb that is known as the ovary. So then what happens is that when the pollen travels in, it fertilizes the ovules, and they turn into a little seed. So then when these are all fertilized, because there has been large amounts of pollen that have traveled and then kind of covered into all the little ovules, then the style kind of closes itself, and then the entire ovary forms into a fruit. That's why when you see, like, and this is my very best representation of an apple, and inside of the apple you have the core, you're going to see that there are tiny little seeds in there. All those seeds are each of these tiny little fertilized ovules. And then when that fruit falls to the ground, then eventually those fertilized seeds will grow into an apple tree, let's say, and that would be the offspring of the original plant or the original flower. So my friends, this is reproduction. It's a lengthy video, but it explains all the different ways in which organisms reproduce. So remember, this is all about how a process that leads to the formation of offspring, which are in the human species babies, and the continuation of the species so that we can avoid extinction. Okay, I hope this makes sense. Ask me, Mrs. Geyer, if you have any questions. Bye, everybody.